This is Basket Case Clubs, CPR Group's podcast where we turn basket case clubs into showcase clubs. Now, the reason that we're here is that often multi-use facilities cause more problems than they solve. So what we're going to go through today is why we do multi-use facilities in the first place, where we've seen troubles, what those troubles have looked like, and leave you with some tools in your tool belt for dealing with the conflicts that often arise in multi-use facilities. So we've got about 45 minutes to get through the content this afternoon. So that's not enough time to unpack every single element of what we're going to go through. So please put your questions into the chat as we go through. Keep your device near you as well, because I'll be running a couple of polls as we go through, because I'm interested in getting a bit of a feel for how things are working in your area. So I can see also we've got a fairly good spread of people joining us today, from people who work for their local councils. We've got some people who are directly involved in sport and community organisations, and some peak body groups as well. So you're often familiar with all of the things that we're going to talk about. So if we do get to a point where you've got a question that we need to dig into in a bit more detail, I'll let you know right up front. Please do leave a note in the chat, because we'll be able to get back to you on that, or feel free to contact us. And the best way to do that is via our website at cprgroup.com.au, and simply click on the little contact button and that will take you straight through. The reason that I'm letting you know that is that sometimes some of the questions that you've got might be getting a little too specific or a little too personal to be able to deal with in what is a fairly public sort of forum today. So if that's the case, then we can connect up one-on-one to go through what those issues are and offer any other solutions or guidance that we may be able to provide as well. So just let me have a quick look at what everyone has said. So Kia Bella, welcome from over the ditch as well. So Australia, what are we? We're the West Island of New Zealand over here, aren't we? So let me have a look. Always keen to keep up to date with what's working at multi-use facilities. Great. So yeah, awesome. This is really good. So also a number of you are from different sorts of in different sorts of roles as well. So when we talk about multi-use of facilities, particularly sporting facilities, we see from a local government perspective that it spans so many of the silos, departments of councils. And look, that little tongue-in-cheek stab there at it being largely siloed is that often the people who sit in different departments have a system or a process for dealing with everything from setting up a lease in the first place through to dealing with complaints when they come in. And often those systems don't overlap. Sometimes they don't even intersect, let alone overlap. So it's important to get on the same page and share this information around as well. So once you get access to the recording of this session, I do encourage you to share it with anyone else in your organisation, particularly for councils, where you think that they might benefit from that information as well. So Petra says that you're looking at a feasibility on a multi-sport precinct at the moment. Yes, look, great time to be here, Petra, as well, because I will be talking about what it takes to set up good multi-use facilities at the beginning, recognising that some of the older challenges that you're seeing in some of the examples that I'll give you this afternoon are unfortunately things that it's too late to solve that from a construction perspective, but it's never too late to go and fix it from a management and operational perspective. So this is a great time to let you know that there's a good old saying, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is right now. So if we can't go back in time and fix things that we didn't get right in the first place, any delays from here only exacerbate the problems that we're already facing. So recognising that we can't go and fix those things that we haven't already fixed, we can now make it better moving into the future. So that's the sort of information that I'm going to share with you this afternoon. Before we launch into the session, I'd like to take a moment recognising how broad and how far and wide our guests are joining us from this afternoon, to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all of the land and all of the waters where you are joining us from today, and of course where I am here in beautiful Yugambeh country this afternoon. I'd like to acknowledge all of the traditional custodians, recognising their connection to the lands that we now deal with from a management perspective, and the care that they've taken for those lands for tens of thousands of years. And I'd like to also pay my respects to any elders past and present, and any First Nations people joining us today as well. So why would we want to use multi-use facilities anyway? For some of the stories that I'm going to tell you, you'll say, well, why would we put ourselves into that situation? In reality, it makes perfect sense. The reason that we have multi-use facilities is because we're not getting any more land. We're getting growing populations in many of the areas where you're joining us from today. And the amount of land that we've got is not increasing. So we need to make the best use of that land. It does make perfect sense, and it is logical. If we've got an oval-shaped field, and we've got a sport that plays on that oval-shaped field in summer, being cricket, and a sport that plays on an oval-shaped field in winter, being AFL, it makes sense that they share. So let's simply stick them together, and what could possibly go wrong? And I think that sort of thinking is definitely outdated. Because you're here, you know that things can go wrong. So, and quite a lot can go wrong. Some of the things that we've seen are really almost juvenile, the sorts of things that sorts of conflicts that we've seen arise. So we've been called in to mediate what I'll call negotiated solutions, because you can't ever solve all of the conflicts that arise over multi-use facilities. But we've been called in to mediate over conflicts like who owns the soft drink in the fridge, or who's got rights to the canteen. And when tempers boil over, things can really get nasty. So it starts typically with shouting matches in the car park, but we've seen problems escalate to deliberate vandalism of fields and buildings just to make life for the other sport or the other user group really difficult. We saw a case this was up north, and it's not too long ago, but we literally saw a person from one club take a tipper of boulders to their own field and dump it on the field, like just so that the other club couldn't use it. Like that took time and it took money to organise that, just for spite, just to spite the other group. So this parochialism that we see when it boils over, and it's this. We see it in sport and community organisations more than we see it in business. Like the way that we see volunteers treated, and the way we see volunteers treating people on either side of the fence, we wouldn't see that at work. You'd get in trouble from Fair Work Australia would come down like a ton of bricks on you, or a truckload full of boulders, pardon the pun. I've also seen I know of a story of a shared sporting facility where there was football and hockey and cricket. And things have improved dramatically over the last 4 or 5 years. But in the old days, there were times when coaches of football teams would deliberately take their footballers right through the middle of hockey training or cricket training sessions just to be belligerent. Like, this is our facility. We've got the numbers. We should be here. We should take precedence. You guys can just hack it. So it's just not right. But I've also seen things go wrong from another angle, which is where we've seen what I'm going to call a lack of leadership from the local government authority, where council hasn't supported the head tenant in this case. So we had a head tenant, which was a football club with, let's say round figures, 1,000 playing members. And it was almost like council was forcing them to share with a cricket club that was not playing the game correctly. Now, by not playing the game correctly, I mean that the cricket club, the predecessors of the people on the cricket club committee now, had signed a sublease. That sublease had been registered on the title. So this is a legally binding document signed under seal by that club as a legal entity. And the people at that club were then saying, but we don't want that. We didn't sign that. Well, this is a lack of understanding about what an incorporated association is. But then that even brings into question the value of this incorporated association. Because I know from my investigations that at the time I was looking into that club, they had not submitted their annual return here in Queensland, that's to the Office of Fair Trading, for the last 11 years. So there was a very good case to say, well, technically they're not incorporated because they're not meeting their obligations under the Associations Incorporation Act. So why would a football club knowingly enter into a contract with an organisation that is on very precarious ground? If I was on the committee of this organisation, I would say I have a duty of care to the organisation, and I have a duty to prevent insolvent trading. Entering into a contract with an organisation that legally might not be here this time tomorrow would not be something that I as a committee member would sign. Yet the council was saying, well, you have to sign it. You have to support them. So it got political, and then it got really nasty. So these are the sorts of things that I'm not telling you anything you don't know. You know of these cases, or you know of cases like these. And I've certainly spoken about these on LinkedIn, for instance. So you know that these sorts of things really happen. But what we're going to go through today is what it takes from a design perspective. So Petra, that's where the position that you're in getting to that stage of designing a new multi-use facility that's going to really work. what maintenance requirements are required, and then what multi-use governance needs to look like. So really, those are the things where I think that a deterioration in those things or a lack of understanding in those things is where the problems commence. So that's why I want to touch on those three things mainly. So let's begin with what it takes to build a good multi-use facility in the first place. So the first point there is to get the brief right. So that means knowing up front which groups that need to be catered for and understanding any hierarchy. So some facilities set up, and this can be as simple as a shared sports court, so an acrylic sports court, where one of the surface that you put down on that court, even though it's multi-line marked, the acrylic surface that we put onto sports courts for netball is quite grippy. So that's great. It means that we can play in the rain, and it means that water will rush off the court quite nicely. But if we try and share that same court with tennis, the tennis players are going to go, well, this court's awful. It plays far too slow because the grippy surfaces are going to grab the tennis ball more. So while the courts look the same, they're very, very different from a playing perspective. So you need to understand these types of limitations from the beginning and understand if there is a hierarchy of organisations that will be sharing a facility, what that hierarchy looks like. The next point there is get it right the first time. So you need to invest enough. Quite often, and this is less so the case now, but in the old days, you've only got to go and look at some of your older sporting facilities and you'll see that there's, for instance, an extreme lack of car parking. So what impact do we think that's going to have on the local community on a Saturday morning where we've got teams coming and going from multiple clubs at exactly the same time and not enough car parking? So it's all well and good to think, well, we'll save some money and we'll save some capital expenditure by saving money and not building it to full capacity now. But that is what has created a lot of the fights that we've seen now. The other thing is when you are building it right the first time, if you do have an oval-shaped facility, but you want it to be multi-use, well, if you just build it oval, fine. It's great for cricket, great for AFL, but it's a compromise for the rectangular field sports. But if you build it wing-shaped, which means that it's an oval, but it then comes out a little bit in there. So if we've got the land to be able to do that, it means that we can put two rectangular fields side by side, an oval around the middle, and a cricket wicket in the middle. So simple things like that cost a bit more money, but they save a lot of money and a lot of time down the track. The next one is to make the facility resilient. So given that we all need to understand that the majority of land where we build sporting facilities around the country, we built it there because it's not very good for development as residential land or commercial land or retail land. So that means that we've got most of our facilities on reclaimed landfill sites and in floodplains in low-lying areas. So that means that all of the designs that we use for our sports facilities should be resilient from the outset. So that means we should be building in flood mitigation measures. We can't stop a flood, and the low-lying land is actually there for a purpose. It means that when our sports fields flood, while it's really annoying for all of us people who work and volunteer in sport, it actually saves the houses and the commercial areas and the retail areas. So those are a little bit higher, and so we're creating detention basins that hold the water so that it doesn't get into those habitable areas. So we need that to be the case. So how can we deal with that? So if we elevate our clubhouses, obviously we need them to be disability accessible, but we can do that. We also need to make sure that we're accommodating the level of use that we're expecting. So this brings up the discussion about, and even the picture that you can see there on the slide, is when and where do we use synthetic surfaces? So if we're going to use a synthetic surface, it means that you can hammer it. You can maximize the intensity of use on a synthetic surface like you can't on a natural turf surface. And it's simply because the impact of the boots on the grass wears it out. Especially now we're into July, so we're starting to see that wear and tear on our winter sports fields pretty significantly across the country. We don't get that on synthetic, which is an absolute win. But it raises questions of the environmental sustainability of synthetic surfaces. If they're full of rubber, what impact does that have when they flood? So what happens to that rubber? What happens, or can we then use a more natural infill like cork, for instance? So there are options that we need to consider. But even building in resilience means that where we do have natural turf facilities, because they are a lot cheaper when it comes to capital, make sure we've got adequate drainage and adequate irrigation so that we can use it for the level of and intensity of use that is expected. And then we get to education. as I might say several times, this is not set and forget. You can't just say, great, that's done. Now we don't have to worry about it at all. Everyone needs to be educated about sharing. So it should cover things like equitable access for all of the groups, and it should be based on really strong policy positions of the landlord, which in most cases is the local council, as well as other documented sharing arrangements. So whether they're included in the actual tenure document, so a lease or a license, or whether there are separate memorandums of understanding or similar documents, it needs to be ongoing. So the people who take on roles on committees in clubs, they're lucky to get a handover for things like meeting minutes and financials, let alone anything about sharing and anything about tenure in the first place. So we really, I often say, don't get upset or angry about having the same conversation. So this is particularly for the people in councils and in peak bodies where you'll find you're having the same conversation. Don't get angry about that same conversation, because while it might be the hundredth time you've had that conversation, for the new volunteer on the other side of the table, it's their first. So treat them with the respect that they need, but bring them up to speed with the objective standard. Understand that the lease, the tenure documents form the objective standard. This is what was signed by your club. So if you don't like it anymore, fine, but that doesn't really matter, because there's a legally binding document here that says your organisation has legally signed this. You're now the leader of that organisation. You're in that position. So, and just because you don't like it, it doesn't in and of itself make it wrong. So make sure that that education is ongoing, because people change in many clubs every single year. And the final point there is the right level of maintenance. So it's all well and good to build the facility in the first place, but if we want them to be able to accommodate the level of use that sharing demands, they need to be well maintained. So that means that the landlord for anything that council needs to look after, you need a maintenance budget big enough to do that. So you can't really just scrimp and save. It's not the sort of thing where it's really not the sort of thing where councillors can come and say, well, we need to borrow money, so let's cut back our maintenance, because that will lead to negative outcomes. We need to make sure that there's enough money in the kitty so that what council needs to do gets done to the right level. But again, it also means that the maintenance obligations of our community organisations that are using the facilities, they need to be well aware of those obligations. And again, that's part of the education. So what is it that the clubs need to do? What is it that the council needs to do? So I've kind of mentioned in passing what I've got here now, leadership. And I think that councils need to take quite a strong leadership position when it comes to facility sharing. So in all of the cases where I told those horror stories at the top, there was a lack of leadership. Somebody needs to step up and say, hang on a minute, this is how it's going to work. Now, I'm not in council, so I can say some things that might be a little controversial. And one of those things is that this can become a very political issue. And when councils don't get involved because of a fear of community backlash, that's purely political. And the question is that the right way to go? So what impact are you having if you're not taking that strong leadership position? So what does leadership look like? So some councils already do a great job in managing the community sport and recreation facilities, but others you might feel that it's a long way from what you think would resemble really good, strong leadership. It's our experience that there's not one right way of doing this that works for absolutely everyone. Now, this can be because of many factors. Often there's a balance between freehold land and crown land, or trust land that's held in trust on behalf of the state. It can also be because of the types of sports that are actually sharing facilities. So some sports might share really well because there's not too much season creep, or they've got good systems for managing the overlap and everyone's getting on fine. But then you introduce another sport that has different maintenance requirements. For instance, if you just look at the grass height, the ideal grass height, so how high do we cut the grass every week or every fortnight? That varies from sport to sport. It can also vary between court sports and field sports, or even why sport facility sharing is needed in the first place. So this can be for a range of reasons. It could just be because, as I said, a lack of available green space, but it could also be that there's not enough money to develop multiple sites so that everyone can have a bespoke area, especially for them. It could be because of a lack of resources, because we don't have enough water, for instance, enough water to irrigate more than one or two fields in some of our regional and remote communities. Or even, there's something, Petra, that you'll be aware of, there's just not a lot of topsoil around in some areas once you move further away from the east coast here in Queensland, or the west coast in WA, where the land becomes more arid and it becomes more rocky, and you don't have enough topsoil to be able to create a lot of facilities. So if you're from an area where you think you've got everything all right, all right already, great. This will be a bit of an interesting expose of where other councils struggle. But if you don't feel that you've got everything right, then hopefully this will give you at least the comfort to know, firstly, you're not alone, and to start the journey of exploring the sorts of changes that you can make. So before I launch into the first poll, if you do choose to make change, so if you don't have good leadership, so if the results of this poll indicate that you don't have great leadership and you need to make change, my suggestion is you don't make massive wholesale changes really quickly all in one go. You're far better off making smaller changes over time so that everyone knows what's coming, and you're also telegraphing the changes before you're making them, so that you can say, okay, so over the next 5 years, this is the journey we're taking. So a change in tenure, a change in subtenant arrangements, but take your time to do that. That also gives you time on both the council side and the club side to save up enough money for what the cost of the transition is going to look like. Okay, so let me jump in and launch this poll for you now. So I'm going to ask you the question, how well do you think council leadership is going in your area? So do you think that it's really, really strong, which would be 5, or do you think that it's really, really weak, which would be a 1? So jump in there and click what you think, or how strong you think your council's leadership is in the area of sharing facilities. As you're doing that, I'll let you know that usually we see polls like this resolve themselves into a bit of a bell curve, but as I'm seeing here, there's a bit of a span. So we've got a few 4s and a few 3s, but also a 1 in the mix. So I'm interested for you to think now. Obviously, you're not necessarily going to want to share too much of why that you think there's poor leadership. So if you're giving it a poor score, well, you don't need to share that with us more publicly. But at least think about it. At least think what does poor leadership look like? What does it feel like? And what do we want? So how do we want our leadership to look, and how do we want our leadership to feel? Sometimes, depending on the position in your organisation where you sit, sometimes you don't necessarily feel that you have the authority to make change up the line. And so that's an important acknowledgement. Who then can you talk to so that you can start to make some change? Okay, so I'll share those results with you, and you can see that it kind of looks like partly a bell curve. Anyway, majority 3, some 4s, no 5s, which is interesting, but there is a 1 in the mix there as well. So where should councils start? Well, I think that I believe that councils should take leadership here, where councils are the landlord, or where councils manage that land on behalf of the state or territory government. So that's, I think, why I'm kind of starting with the point of councils taking that leadership role. But where's the best place to start? I think it's what I call philosophy. So I've broadened this out a little bit. So when we talk about leasing in our leasing webinar earlier in the year, I introduced the concept of councils having a good philosophy on what they want from their community tenure policy. This broadens it out a little bit because we need to bring in some elements of facility sharing as well. So when you're determining a policy position, this policy kind of works on a spectrum, on a range of spectrums, as you can see there. So it's thinking, okay, so in giving land to the community, what's the basis for us doing that? Are we trying to do this on a full cost recovery model where all of our outgoings and all of the maintenance costs and the capital costs will be directly passed on to a tenant? By the way, we don't see that happen very often because it really wouldn't be sustainable, especially given the current operating model of community sport in Australia and New Zealand. Or do we want to go to the other end of the spectrum and say, well, we want to give everything away for nothing? Giving everything away for nothing also typically doesn't work particularly well, because that means that it's everyone who's paying for those sporting facilities. So ratepayers who might not like or care about sport are also being dragged into the discussion and forced to pay through their rates. So I think that it's really important that we get clear on this philosophical position that then informs the policy. So what sort of demand is there for facilities where we are? Do we have design standards that we can refer to? Then those design standards need to filter down and be included in our consideration to how we're going to maintain the facilities. How here means largely who. Whose responsibility will it be for maintaining different aspects of the facility? So building maintenance, internal maintenance, external maintenance, statutory maintenance, structural maintenance, field maintenance, watering, mowing, uh, going in and fixing the drainage systems, line marking. All of this needs to be clearly mapped out. So having a philosophical position about whose job certain things should be before we actually start to note things down in a policy is really helpful because it gives us kind of a North Star, a position that we can say, this is what we want, this is how we want to be giving our land out, and then we go in and do the how we're actually going to do that. So then we talk about the cost recovery model. So that's kind of cost recovery. This end doesn't work. The full maintenance, everything done by the local government authority, that end doesn't really work. So then we can say if there's a continuum here, where on this spectrum is the best place for us to exist? We can define that. Just because we are at a certain point or we feel that we're at a certain point, doesn't mean that's where we need to stay. But it's clear. It's important that everyone is clear and everyone is on the same page. Serviceability means that it needs to work from both positions as well. We need to make sure that the local government authority can afford, if they're going to rest back, come this way from the cost recovery model, how do we afford that? And if we're going to move this way from the local government authority doing everything, how do we make sure that our clubs who are using the land have good business models in place that they're going to be able to service the tenure and their responsibilities for maintenance over time. And it even then comes down to what is our desired tenure type. Do we want to basically hand everything over through by way of a lease? Because remember that a lease is a divestment. So the city or the LGA technically takes that asset off its asset register if it's leased, and then it should go onto the asset register of the tenant then. Is that what we want? Or do we still want to maintain some control so it stays on our asset register, which might mean another form of tenure, which I'll touch on in a moment as well. So once we've got that policy, the philosophical position, then we move into the policy, which is basically telling us how we want to put that into practice. So when it comes to the policy, let's start with consistency. Without having a framework, it means that we used to have old handshake deals, the old good old days where the president of the club and the mayor would shake hands and say, yep, that's good, mate, that's rock solid, that's all you ever need. The clubs in those cases usually would feel pretty happy that they'd have their field and the mayor could always swoop in and save the day if things start to go sideways. And then that at least makes the mayor look strong in the media. But over time, we've seen the clubs on handshake agreements really tend to develop a sense of entitlement that just doesn't exist. And they've even started to make up their own rules as they go along. It was interesting, a couple of weeks ago, I got an email that, we dealt with this club kind of in a peripheral matter, but because my email address was still on the database for that club, this plea that said, please help us let the state government acknowledge that we own this building. Why would they own a building that's on state government land? Okay, they may have contributed to it, but there's typically a line in the lease, and I knew that in this case there was, that said when the lease expires, any improvements that you've made to that land that you don't take with you become the property of the landowner. So that's kind of common. So misconceptions there really we've seen them really run very, very deep. So we think that it makes sense then that these sorts of positions should be set and they should be established by council right at the top. So what sort of support then? So once we've got consistency and we understand that, and our philosophical position may help here, we might be able to say, well, if the city's going to absorb more or less of the maintenance, depending on where on the continuum we are, how do we make sure that we've got a way to be consistent yet equitable across the board? And what sort of support does that mean that we're providing to our community organisations? The tenure documents and the policy all set what I like to call the objective standard. Now, I'm borrowing that term from Roger Fisher and William Ury from their 1981 book. I think we'll get to that soon. getting to yes. So it's all about negotiation. When you're negotiating on something, it's really helpful if there is somewhere where it's just black and white and it says, this is how it needs to be, and the policy is the starting point for that. So if there's a disagreement or an argument down the track, we can come back to a document that we all agreed set the standard at the beginning, and we can then apply what's in there. When we get into doing the policy, it's then really important that we understand what are the principles on which we want to base that policy. So typically principles, and we certainly talked about this when we went through it from a leasing specific perspective. But I now wanted to say, well, the principles that I've suggested there in the left-hand column, they're nice and basic, they're clear. We should be starting from a safety first standpoint. We should be looking for a way to be equitable, so groups that can afford and are making good money out of the land that all of us as ratepayers own, there's some way that they're contributing back to that, and the groups that are providing a great community service but don't have the ability because of the nature of their operation or the size or what they do. So for instance, some small community service charity organisations don't have money-making opportunities by the nature of their operation and the nature of their facilities. Yet a 1,000-member strong AFL club might run a really successful bar and a really successful canteen, so they are generating revenue. So equity doesn't mean equality. It doesn't mean we need to treat everyone the same, but it does need a level of consistency. So we, again, and an objective standard in the policy that says this is how we're defining those groups that we might charge more or give more maintenance responsibilities to, and those that we might provide more support to by lower fees or lower maintenance obligations. We want to make sure that whatever systems we set up, they are easy. If it gets too complicated, then it is much harder to implement. And if we on the council side can't understand it and can't understand how to apply it, then how do we think that these new mums and dads who are reluctantly forced onto committees with no idea about facility or asset maintenance, how do we think they're going to be able to cope? So we need to make sure that it's simple enough. We also need to make sure that financial viability works both ways, that we're not going to put the city out of business and we're not going to put clubs out of business. And as I mentioned, as we were talking about flooding, having awareness of what we're leaving for the future, so that we're not doing things on our land that is going to make it a poor facility for generations to come. So what I've then got in the little yellow box on the right then is firm positions on things that really do need to be taken. So what do we mean by business sustainability? How does that work on both sides? What is our cost recovery position? Where on this continuum are we going to position ourselves? Who's responsible for maintenance and all of the different types of maintenance? Who's responsible for facility renewal, which means bringing a building that has deteriorated or a facility or an asset that has deteriorated back up to a fit for purpose standard? And who's responsible for upgrading facilities? And then we need firm positions on facility sharing and multi-use. And yes, they should consider things like making sure that anyone using the facility is a viable business. That's really, really important, because we don't want to be leasing out facilities or even licensing out facilities to organisations that don't have the wherewithal or the capacity or the money to be able to look after them for our community. So it takes firm positions there in those principles. So the different types of tenure agreements that we go through range from where the city can maintain very close control, where to the other end of the spectrum, where the local government authority basically says, you know what, that's your facility, you now look after it. So it's your facility, that's basically a lease, where as I said before, the land is basically divested, so it comes off the local government authority's asset register and should go onto the asset register of the community organisation. But there's a range of other ways that we can do that leave a bit more control with the local government authority. So we can see things like a seasonal booking, where instead of actually having tenure rights to a facility, a user only has access to it for very defined dates. And when that date comes, typically a little bit after grand final date, you're out, and then the other tenant comes in. There's no one size fits all, and there's no perfect solution in all of this, but it really comes back to the answers to those previous questions. What's our philosophy? How do we feel about this? What are the principles under which we want to create our policy? And then what does our policy look like? And then the policy then defines which one of these sorts of agreements we're going to use. So it's time to point squarely at the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is that we're talking about the political landscape of councils. And as I mentioned, the community tenure can become a political football. Where councils don't have strong or they don't have policy frameworks at all, councillors can feel that it would be politically unpopular for them to enforce formal tenure on clubs or to enforce the conditions that already exist in formal tenure documents. However, and as we have seen, the cost of not acting usually far outweighs the time and investment it takes to sort the issues out correctly once and for all. So yes, it can be painful, but it's just off with the band-aid. That's what we should be doing, because once we deal with it, we just go through with that. Now, it's all really easy for me to say this, not a politician, and not invested as much as politicians are in each of our councils. But I think it's worth the effort to do what's right so that then we can create a consistent system from now on. That's a very difficult battle. Hence why I've said this is the elephant in the room. So I want you to be aware, and this is why I said after the last poll, be aware of what good leadership should look like, and then work out what level of influence that you can have to try and get the right people thinking the right way about how this system should be set up. What then happens when we jump to the position right now, which is why some of you might be here, to say, well, how do we deal with the conflicts when they arise? So that's what I want to share with you now. I want to share with you some conflict management tactics at a high level. And once we deal with you directly, so if you've got some of these concerns that you want to share with us privately, then we can start to say, okay, so how do we implement this position? So this tactic level position. So I want to share with you a number of ways or a number of tactics that you can use to deal with conflict when it arises, based on two elements. So the first one is concern for self, and the other one is concern for other on the x-axis. So if I'm highly concerned for myself, it's my interests that I'm caring about. If I'm highly concerned for the other party, it's their interests that I'm more concerned about. So the first one is when I don't really care about my interests and I don't really care about theirs. I'm just going to avoid the conflict in the first place. Unfortunately, we see this both from club perspective and from council perspective, where we just say, oh, there's this problem bubbling along there. We've even seen it in the media, but let's just not say anything. Let's stick our head in a bucket of sand and hope it goes away. Avoiding conflict does not make conflict get any better. You know that, yet we still do it. We do it because it's easy. The little LL there means lose-lose. This is the sort of tactic that we do when let's just move on without doing anything about it. So nobody wins there. The next one is when I really care about myself and I don't care about you, and it's where I'm going in with a competitive mindset. This one also doesn't work because it's win-lose. It means for me to win, you have to lose. And we certainly see this start to take shape where we've got two co-tenants just butting heads together. It's, well, I have to win, and this is why we saw the boulders dumped on the field. I have to win, and for me to win, you have to lose. And then what are these guys going to say? Well, I have to win now, so you have to lose. So never-ending battle, and again, nobody actually wins because the relationship is destroyed. Then we go the other way and we say, well, okay, you have it your way then, just so we can get this over and done with. That's a lose, win, or accommodation tactic. Again, it's ineffective because if we're not standing up for our own rights, especially when those rights are supported by the objective standard, then we're putting ourselves in a terrible position where people are going to continue to walk all over us anyway. And then we get to the most mature of these forms so far, which is collaboration, or a win-win outcome. So this is where instead of just saying, you know what, let's just finish it and move away, let's work towards finding out how we can both win here. So I'll come back to that in a moment and explain that in a bit more detail. But before I do, I'm not finished, because there's also no win, no lose, which is the compromise. Compromise can be effective in cases where we need to reach a conclusion and we need to move on. But typically compromise is when everyone gives up a little bit so that the positions get to a point where it's, oh, okay, let's move on. But it's quite different from a win-win. A win-win is to say, well, let's understand the basis of the positions and then start to make decisions. Compromise is kind of like 1 + 1 = 1.5. Yet collaboration is 1 + 1 can equal 1,000. 1 + 1 can equal 5. So we're usually able to find solutions that work more strongly right across the board. So the most mature here, though, is the idea here is that, and let's take the football and cricket example that I started with. Let's get to a point where we find a win-win solution. And in that case, there was the football club, the cricket club, and the council. Let's find a position where we can all achieve great things, or we say we're going to agree to disagree, but we're going to do so agreeably, hence the little smiley face. So it's win-win or no deal. How do we get to that point? Now, before I go through and give you a little bit more information here, I'll just go and cross-check the comments. Some multi-use looking at going larger. Okay, thanks, Stephen. That's good to know. Great. Yeah, okay. So Petra said enforcement of conditions can be hard when there are individual council agendas. Yeah, that's a really, really good point. Individual council laws, and especially Petra in Queensland, where we've got the Local Government Act that kind of says, you know, you do your job, you do governance strategy, we'll do the implementation under the leadership of the CEO. That's where we should be staying. Sometimes that line can be quite blurred. But again, if we've got a strong policy, if we've got a strong philosophy, and, you know, even just park the policy for a little while and go right back to that philosophical discussion and get all of the councillors involved. And that's certainly what we prefer to do. We prefer to get the councillors involved nice and early, because ultimately they're going to be making the decision. So if officially we go and create a perfect system, officially and logically, but then we put that to them politically and they say, but hang on, we don't mind spending more money. We're going to save some money over here and we're going to move things around so that we've got more money to spend on maintenance. We kind of need to know those positions up front. So to get into a little more detail then, and to bring back the concept of the objective standard, I want to talk through how we can get to this win-win or no deal position. So I mentioned Roger Fisher and William Ury earlier, and they are the authors of a book called Getting to Yes, which this is the framework from Getting to Yes. It's about principled negotiation. So the first step is to separate the people from the problem. It's to say, instead of just saying the cricket club and the AFL club that had the rocks on the field, instead of just saying, this is you because you're a so-and-so, no, it's you because you're a so-and-so, it's, well, hang on a minute. This behavior is behavior. It doesn't define the person. And we've seen it, just think of sideline behavior. We've seen really well-adjusted, clever, smart, thinking mums and dads on the sideline yelling abuse and obscenities at 15-year-olds. That's not the sort of behavior that is naturally them. So let's understand that the problem that we're facing, in that case, it's the behavior. In this case, it's the fact that we can't agree on shared use of this facility. Let's say, okay, well, let's say that's the problem that we're facing. It's not the people. What that allows us to do when we stop focusing on the people and start focusing on the issue is you quite literally sit on the same side of the table. So this is a little secret that some of you may have actually been in a room where I've done this deliberately. You might not have noticed, but sometimes in setting up a meeting room, I will position myself not opposite somebody, but next to them. So and there's a reason. If there's only two of us in a meeting, then we'll sit on the same side of the table and I'll put a screen up. And it's literally so we're sitting next to each other and looking at the problem from the same side. If there's three of us in a discussion, it's two of us sitting on this side and then somebody at the head of the table, but not opposite. Because when you create the dynamic of sitting opposite, those of you with kids know this, sitting opposite them, it always feels confrontational. But if you sit side by side and look at the problem, then all of a sudden you're physically in a position where you're trying to work together to solve the problem together. The next step is to focus on interests, not positions. So people have taken a position that says, I want more of the field use, I want more of the field use. That's the position. Okay, but why? Well, we've got this off-season program that we want to run. Okay, why do you want to run the off-season program? Well, for fitness, for cross-training, for making money. Okay, so that's the problem. What have you got? Well, that's when our season starts. And now we're starting to talk about the reasons that people have taken a position, and sometimes that position can be purely belligerent. There's a little caveat here, I should say. Some people are just belligerent and are unreasonable, and sometimes they do need to be sidelined. But I'll come back to that because that's really talking about the BATNA. But focus on the interests that sit beneath the positions, not the positions themselves, because then we're starting to ask why. So in that case, this tenant over here that wants to do the off-season program, does it have to be here or could it be somewhere else? So is there another facility elsewhere where they could do exactly the same thing and achieve exactly the same result, just done in a different way? which leads to the third point, which is generate options. But this one is where you brainstorm, and why sitting on the same side of the table with a flip chart or a screen in front of you is so powerful. Generating options starts with brainstorming. Brainstorming means there are no bad ideas. So you can throw up onto the screen, the cricket club has it 100% of the year. All right, we'll throw up on the screen, the AFL club has it 100% of the year. All right, those are both options. Let's put them up. We share 50-50, we share 75-20. Just put everything up. But then we start to get into a bit more detail about, all right, well, if we can't fit together because we don't have enough car parking, build a multi-story car park. Okay, we don't have enough money to build a multi-story car park, but at brainstorming stage, no poo-pooing any ideas. There's no bad ideas at brainstorming stage. You can start to cross ideas out that are unfeasible or unaffordable, but not at the beginning, not at brainstorming stage. So just get all of the ideas on the table. Even just by going through that, you might start to say, well, actually, that one looks best. And yes, we can go and do this over here. We can maybe build another bring in a food truck, for instance, because we don't have access to the canteen. Whatever it is, you've started to come up with ideas and a solution might come out purely because you're sitting on the same side of the table. And then we get back to the objective standard. So if we can't agree on something, where do we go to look at the black and white? And that's why it's so important to get that objective standard up front, to get the philosophy right, to get the principles right, and to get the policy right, and then obviously to get the tenure documents right, because that's where it's written. Even though I'm not the one who signed it, it was still signed under seal for my club, so it's still right. And the final one is know your BATNA. So this is where I said some people are just belligerent. BATNA stands for, and this is from Getting to Yes, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And this is where leadership comes into it as well. If we can't solve this problem by coming to an agreement where everyone is happy, then what does walking away look like? What does no deal actually look like? And for a regional council, for instance, that might mean, well, we're going to have to get involved and spend a bit more money. For a large metro council, for instance, it might mean, well, we're actually going to remove that tenant because we do have a waiting list of viable tenants who are prepared to take over that facility. So where do you want to stand? And then obviously having those principles and the philosophical position to begin with kind of give us that North Star to say, are we going to do that? Do we have the strong enough leadership to do that? These are all great questions for you to be asking. And finally, this is not set and forget. So great facility sharing comes down to having great people who are well informed and educated. They know the objective standard, having great governance systems, and really good communication. Communication is very, very often when I say, what's the biggest problem you're facing? Oh, communication. Communication's terrible around here. Well, I always argue with that because I think communication's not the disease. I think it's just a symptom of another disease that's usually more insidious. So the disease of poor communication often comes down to, I've got information and it means power and I don't want to tell you because then I retain my power. So I don't want to tell. The next one is, I don't want to listen. So you've sent me emails, you've sent me memos, but I don't want to read those because I just don't care enough. So I don't want to listen. But there's an even more insidious one, which is, okay, I'm out here and I know you know something, but I'm going to not ask you that question because then I've got plausible deniability. So that is, I don't want to ask. So I don't want to tell, I don't want to listen, or I don't want to ask. And then we can say, okay, so if it's one of those, why? Why are we taking that position of poor leadership and trying to retain power that's, it's almost absurd when we think about, well, no, it is, I think it is absurd when we think about it, that we shouldn't be putting petty little arguments in over and above really what needs to be great support for all of the tenants, because if we give good support for tenants, then those tenants give good support to their communities. So I'm going to launch the final poll here now. And this one asks you about the support that you think your council provides to clubs. So how would you rate the level of support that your council gives to clubs? So from either side of the table, if you're within the local government authority, great, let us know. What's the level of support? So here I mean things like education and training, capacity building, maybe even money. How well do you support your tenants through access to facilities? If you're on the other side of the table, if you are a tenant, then what does it feel like to you? Okay, this is really good and really interesting. So keep those coming in. We've got, actually, this is tending more to the high side. So I'm very happy to see that. And I 100% urge you to keep that going. Don't don't lower the level of support that you're giving to yourself. I'll share those results with you as well. So don't lower that level of support that you're giving to tenants. Make sure that they've got access to people to be able to answer questions, but great systems and consistency. Where you need to involve your political representatives, please make sure that the education that we talked about goes to them as well, because they will very often be the first person that somebody in a club goes to. So if there's a problem, they'll go straight to the counsellor. So it's important that the counsellor is informed, that they have the information and the backup that they need to be able to either answer questions or refer those questions to the right department within council. So that brings us to the end of what I wanted to go through today. So if you've got any other questions, bung them into the chat there. But I'll let you know what's coming up in our free webinar program. So next month we're looking at funding. So that's okay, where's their funding available? But really the focus of that session is on how you can most effectively access that funding. So what modern tools are available. So AI, I'm definitely looking at you to make sure that you're accessing funding in as effective way as you can. Then we've got the Constitution session coming up in September. Now that is surprisingly interesting. So there's so many, we reckon that there's about 300,000 community organisations, incorporated associations, companies limited by guarantee across the country at any time. And so it's really important that we've got our most hierarchical document, the governance document, right. So that's the Constitution. What does that mean? How do we make changes? What do we need to do? Then we'll deal with meetings, so how to have great meetings. By the way, meetings are for making decisions. So how do we get all of the information dealt with so that by the time we get to the actual meeting, we're able to make good decisions that lead to strong actions. And then it's those actions that make great organisations. So that's in October. And then rounding out the year with legal requirements. So, we talk about the legal requirements for community organisations to be able to follow. What does that actually mean? What pieces of legislation do we need to be able to make sure that we're complying with? So to register for those, you can simply go to cprgroup.com.au/webinars. So there's the web address there, and you can go to the webinars section there. Now, for this section, I can see there's no more questions come in. I've got some homework for you. It's very easy homework. You're not going to get marked on it, but I'd encourage you to do it. So there's one thing to read and one thing to listen to. So the first one is a blog that goes through some of the content that we've been through today in a bit more detail and in a way that you'll be able to refer to it again as you then go to put together your own information. So I'll open up the chat and put that into here. So here's a link to a blog. It's called Defining the Rules of the Game, Tenure Policies for Shared Facilities. So that's where you can access that one. And the next one is then when conflict arises over shared sports facilities, how do we deal with that? So this one's called Get Off My Field, Dealing with Conflict Over Shared Sports Facilities. And this is an episode, I think it's episode 22 of our podcast, Basket Case Clubs. So that's the give. If you are interested in these sorts of topics, then Basket Case Clubs is a fun place to get some information. It's where we get really raw and we tell some stories in detail without giving away any confidential or private information about the sorts of silly things that basket case clubs do. But more importantly, it's then what have those basket case clubs been able to do to change to then become showcase clubs? And we've certainly seen that happen. It is possible. Sometimes it takes a bit of a mindset shift, but it is possible to move from being a basket case to being a showcase. And if you've enjoyed this session and you enjoy the sessions that we provide, then if I can ask for a favour, 5-star Google reviews absolutely help more wonderful people like you find us. Now, what we do in supporting councils, supporting community organisations, supporting clubs, supporting peak bodies is pretty hard to search for. So how do we find somebody who can actually help us understand what are our legal obligations? How can we find someone who can prepare our constitution with a human-centric focus because they're experienced? Positive Google reviews enable people who don't know that we can provide that sort of support and help them to be able to find us. So it's certainly not about my ego. It's certainly about helping others find us. So if you'd like to do a favor for somebody else to help somebody else in a precarious position find us, snap the little QR code there and leave us a great review. That would be very, very handy. Thank you very much. So that leads us to the end of the session today. I'll hang around for another couple of minutes if there's any questions that you'd like to bung into the chat. But otherwise, we look forward to seeing you again this time next month. Thanks, everyone.
Basket Case Clubs acknowledges the traditional custodians of the country on which we record, being Yugambeh, Turrbal, Jagera and Kabi Kabi land. We recognise their enduring connection to land, waters and culture, and pay our respect to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to First Nations listeners.